Okay, so I think we are ready to begin with our panel, which is the last session today. And my introduction to the panel will be very brief because all of the panelists have already been introduced. So the panel is a discussion about defining pantomime, with leading questions being as follows. What are the overlapping and distinct structural, functional, etc. characteristics of pantomime in language evolution, gesture studies, primatology, neuropathology, and other related fields? Does it make sense to attempt to spell out the general definition of pantomime across those disciplinary boundaries? Are there any subcategories of pantomime that are distinct from each other, but all of which exemplify pantomime? And the last question, what are the communicative advantages and limitations of pantomime? So with those leading questions, I will ask now each of our three panelists to for a 5-minute presentation, and then we'll have a discussion involving the audience. Okay, the floor is yours, starting with Jordan.
Okay, thank you. Is this the microphone that I should use? Right, anti-alphabetical order was suggested, hence for once having the name Zlatev is an advantage. I think I was a bit puzzled with the metaphor that Mike was using in the morning with the elephant. And the question is if pantomime is the elephant or rather the sense of touch, but it dawned on me that it's a very good question, because either we're focused on pantomime itself, ergo the elephant with different perspectives on it, but it's more complex than that, because we're interested in something else but pantomime. You know, pantomime is the means towards that something else, be that language, be that narrative, be that evolution of language, etc. Right? And I think one of the reasons that we have, you know, a hard time calibrating our notions of pantomime is because we have different interests. We're starting from different sides and different perspectives as well. So there are very hard questions that you had, but in those few minutes and the end of the day, I'm not going to try to answer them. What I will do here in 4 points also is give my answer, which is my perspective on the elephant and the elephant on further phenomenon. As I have tried to define pantomime with colleagues in various papers, is as a communicative system. So not as just individual acts. And I think that transpired in some of the discussion. And what is crucial for this communicative system is that it's based on signs. And I don't know if the Zoom guests can see the image there. This is one way to illustrate the notion of a science that we operate with in cognitive semiotics in Lund, at least. So there has to be a conscious interpreter making the distinction between representamen, this is Peirce's term, you can just say expression, and object. And what makes this a very challenging thing is, and demanding cognitively, is not just making the differentiation, but being aware that this is asymmetrical. It's the expression that represents the object, not vice versa. And furthermore, there's an element of construal. So the sign is a certain perspective on the object. Now, what are the signs in pantomime? Well, for me, they're gestures. I don't make a categorical distinction between pantomime and gesture. I'd rather see gesture as the core of pantomime. So that means that all these gestural expressions have to be both differentiated from the objects and understood as representing them. So this is why I think that it is a very this understood. It's challenging and arguably unique for human beings. Both these differentiations and understanding happen somewhere at the Second World Era of Life, and Monica Boruta-Żywiczynska is investigating that in her PhD thesis, for example. So the side components are gestures, but what kind of gestures? Well, a simple way to answer that is pantomimic gestures. Kind of a circular answer, but we did actually give in the paper with Slavik and Przemyk, a number of features of pantomimic gestures formulated as a Klein. So in terms of dominant semiotic ground, and semiotic ground is what links expression and content. There are three kinds, either iconicity, resemblance, indexicality, contiguity, or conventionality in symbols. In reality, it's always a combination of these three. It's never only one. So more iconicity than conventionality. What kind of iconicity? Well, more primary than secondary. Primary iconicity and secondary iconicity, it's kind of an analogous distinction to the one that I made today with primary and secondary narrativity. In primary iconicity, the resemblance is so transparent that the resemblance between expression and object helps you understand the object. In secondary, somebody first has to point out the resemblance, and then you say, aha, now I see it. More of the body than less of the body. So you don't require categorically to be whole body, but rather the more of the body is used, and I think that was beautifully shown in Anna's talk today, how those signs, and now in both the sign language science and the semiotic science started with much more pantomimic, and then became gradually less so as they became more conventional, more systematic, more linguistic. A first-person perspective rather than a third-person perspective, or a character viewpoint in McNeil's terms. This often overlaps with the last distinction, enacting versus other modes. So enacting is body to body rather than representing or embodying, right? But again, not a categorical distinction. I would agree with some people who said, well, even if you had done it like that, it would still be a kind of a pantomime, but it would be less pantomimic gesture. And again, more proximal than distal. This is a distinction we took from Brown's paper. So eating versus flying. And the more of these features on the left side are done, the more pantomimic gesture will be. And then that's also a kind of a climb to see how we'll move from pantomime towards proto-language in various contexts. And the last one is something that we came on today, and I think that here is a figure that I like using, that take from Collins' Paleopoetics, in which he places, he cuts in terms of sensory modality, visual, auditory, and he gives kind of a visionary climb on how evolution could have operated on those two modalities. And here I do mean modalities and sensory modalities. He doesn't have a place for pantomime, but he talks there about iconic gestures, then gradually moving towards the symbolic, that is the more conventional and the more third person, etc. And I think there is no reason a priori to discount vocalizations and even proto-depiction, like some traces left on surfaces from this stage of pantomime, to wit, 1.5 million years ago. And then the rest is just, not silence, but the rest is just gradual evolution.
No, I'm not. I did not prepare. Hello. Well, what to say? I agree with Jordan that pantomime can be viewed as a communicative system used by modern humans. Tomorrow, Paulo will talk with us about that. We can use pantomime describing plan, narrating, telling jokes, etc. So it can also be used for teaching, and Garden Force could explain us this deep argument that pantomime for teaching is even an evolutionary older phenomenon than pantomime for communication. That I would like to hear from him. Talking in advantages, I think the freedom and the spontaneity and the beauty of pantomime surpasses words or signs of a language, so it's a kind of an advantage. Of course, this has a limitation, and because of its uniqueness, it's not replicable and does not obey to structural restrictions of modern language systems, and that may be the reason why when a natural or emergent sign language, artificial or not, and we have the example that I was telling in the interval in our break about Yasmin Motamedi of artificial sign language in the lab. It begins, pantomime never ends in pantomime. So it's a kind of searches for a more efficient and a more conventionalized system for communication. Regarding the attempt to spell out a general definition of pantomime, I don't know if it's possible, because many disciplines have different perspectives on that. So it would be difficult. It's like for narrative, you're telling us that it's difficult to get a common definition on narrative. Well, for pantomime also, I think, because it's viewed differently, and that's it. I don't know if for any subcategories of pantomime that are distinct from each other and can exemplify, but Brown did it with his egocentric versus allocentric point of view. You were talking about the character point of view also, and well, they went far more in this discussion than me, so maybe they could make an attempt here in the round table to help us to this issue. So Michael, I will.
Thank you. I agreed to take part on the panel, but I don't think I ever saw the questions, so I can't answer them. All I can say is my colleagues are very learned and have contributed a lot. What I'm going to do instead is just pick three of the speakers, Anna, Anne, and Laurel, and say that I don't think we can find one definition of pantomime, and that rather our general strategy must be to rather understand how do we learn from each of their domains, and then how can we bring it together. In one case, we're looking at, here are children with modern brains, their only catch is that they don't have hearing. And then we have this amazing transformation from their isolation in a family to their growth once they're in a shared community. So we notice they're in an environment in which is already communicatively rich, but from which they're excluded. But this shapes the way they go. With Anne, on the other hand, we're looking at apes, and we're finding that perhaps there are rare examples of pantomime that seem to extend the notion of instrumental gestures that we can see a lot about in the apes, where it's an ad hoc performance that is used to sort of say, do it again, or something of that kind. Laurel gave us this immense insight into some of the brain's complexities, but in fact her pantomime was such a small fraction of what we've talked about when we were, for example, considering narrative. It's sort of, how do you use a toothbrush, that level. And yet we found that already just figuring out how do you use a toothbrush, and relating the difference between when you could cheat, as it were, and look at an actual toothbrush and exploit its affordances, or you weren't even able to do that, versus being able to do it when you had the toothbrush, but not when you had no toothbrush to give you visual hints about how to do it. So that gives us yet another thing. If that's so complicated, what are the challenges in understanding how to put it together? So that's really the spirit in which I approach this excellent feast of ideas from day one and look forward to day two, is not in the hope of a single unified definition, but rather what is the special definition implicit in each focused study in a different domain, and then how can we, not in 2 days, but as we reflect on this and begin to see those emerging connections from really understanding the basic components in the way that Laurel did, seeing how even apes apparently can come up with some aspects of pantomime but not developing into a rich communicative system, and most of the examples seeming to depend more on compliant humans in the environment, which then leads us into Anna, where the children, once they go from parents who ignore their signing, the little home signs, to a community in which they're excited to share them, you begin to get this transition from pantomime to a rich communicative system.
Okay, thank you very much for your opening speeches, and now the floor is open to discussion, including our Zoom participants.
Well, is there somebody who believes there is one definition? Hands up. There you go. Give the man a microphone.
Actually, I don't believe there is one definition. I just wanted to take the floor. I mean, like our definition, like we had two definitions, but 2018, actually, the title says that this is the definition for language origins, and this is kind of specifically calibrated to language evolution research. But related to what Anne Rassen said, I think it's important that we sort of talk across boundaries, because, like, particularly thinking about the evolution of human communication and human cognition, we always look for the baseline. So I guess that's very fruitful to see what apes do and what makes sense to them, and what are the differences between what humans do, what modern humans do, and that we can take as a proxy of what happened in our evolution. So sometimes, even if we have different definitions, it's useful to compare those definitions to sort of reflect on what we are dealing with, be it non-human apes or human pantomiming.
I have a comment here, is that if it's okay? Hi, it's Laura. Can you hear me?
Yes.
But not say.
Great. And I didn't prepare anything either. And I agree completely with what many of you have said, and what Michael said about the complexity and how we need to be very precise, I think, about what kind of gesture we're talking about. So I find it useful to think about, and you probably talked about it early this morning, and I didn't get up very, very early, I'm sorry, but that sort of the distinction between sort of the deictic, metaphoric, iconic, and beat gestures, which accompany speech in humans, and which one are we talking about? When we talk about pantomime in great apes, are we talking about iconic gestures? Are we talking about signifiers, deictic, pointing gestures? So that's one place I think we should really label things carefully. My other thought is, in terms of the brain of great apes versus humans, and we know that there are a lot of differences in lateralization of function in humans. We know there's a massive left hemisphere architecture for speech and semantics and gesture that are not there. I mean, we see expansion of the parietal lobe, we see expansion of the temporal lobe in humans, and so I think maybe for me, the neuroanatomy might also constrain our expectations about parallels versus distinctions that we expect to see. And the symbolic nature of our human gesture, the communicative nature it sounds like it's present in great apes. It's just much more elaborated in humans. And so my point was, be more specific about what type of gesture you're talking about, understand the underlying constraints that the actual neural architecture gives us. The lateral, one more thing, a lateralization of function goes along with handedness, and handedness goes along with tool use. So these things co-evolve. This is a lot of Michael talks about these kinds of things. And so I think they're really important to put constraints on where we expect to see parallels and where we don't. That's it for now.
Thank you.
Can I briefly clarify? So when I argue that pantomime is uniquely human, first of all, this should be understood as a hypothesis, as Francesco and others often say. This is our hypothesis. And it's something that we have been working on as working hypothesis for the last 15 years, looking at both non-human evidence and experimental and so on, maybe not sufficiently of the neuroscientific kind that you mentioned now. But unique doesn't mean there is like a universal module that came through some saltation to make the pantomime grammar or something like that. Much rather, we would expect to have these kind of proto pantomimes of the kind that have been mentioned today. But the reason that I would still hypothesize that true pantomime is human unique is precisely because, one, the gestures that you're asking about are not just predominantly iconic. There are a lot of iconic gestures that could be, but the iconicity is just on the side of the beholder. So much ontogenetically ritualized gestures in non-humans can be explained through ontogenetic ritualization, but there would be true signs if the subject herself understands the gesture as representing the object. And I think for that you need a higher form of reflective consciousness, that it's not again that it could never happen in enculturated contexts such as Coco or Kanzi, etc., but it needs a lot of training to get this off the ground. And I think there are good evolutionary reasons for that also, because once you've opened that door, you've opened not just to tactical deception, but to liar's paradise, liar's heaven, as Daniel Dorr says. But it's not language that opens liar's heaven, as Dorr says. It's rather sign use that does that. And as we've said at this conference, pantomime is the door opener.
Thank you. Do we have further questions or comments from the audience? Maybe I'll just ask one question to our neuroscience experts. So when you mention that there is a massive neural architecture for speech, do you think that it's a fruitful area of inquiry to try to infer like evolutionary trajectory of that from fossil skulls, from endocasts, or this is on like the evidence is on such a general level that it's effectively impossible?
Can I have a go? Well, I mean, all we've got really is endocasts that says, you know, this part of the brain looks as if it might have been a bit bigger than that part of the brain. And I don't think you can really make much use of that until you have a pretty good idea of what might be the tractography and so on. So I think some of the studies that have been perhaps closer to the mark are the ones out of Emory University that Laurel also knows about, by Hecht and Stout and others, where, for example, they will train humans to do stone napping of various complexity, and then they'll do scans to see what is the temporary change in diffusion tensor imaging of different tracts, to create hypotheses of the kind that the transition from older one stone tool making focus on just getting a flake to a Julian based on shaping the core to make an axe versus something else, that the temporary changes they see during the learning of that difference might suggest changes in tractography. So that was one thing. And then Hecht and her colleagues had a study of what sardonically was referred to as mirror neurons, comparing actual monkeys, macaques, and actual chimpanzees and actual humans, and showing there were differences in the actual tracts there. And I think this comparative study says it's not just how big a region is, it's what the connectivity is. And I think that's going to give us more clues than just saying, here's a bulge in the skull, which suggests there might have been a bigger parietal cortex.
I can't add anything. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, and apparently there is a question on Zoom from Stephen Brown. So, Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. Sorry that I couldn't be there. I'm sorry that I missed the morning session. Michael, you look very dapper in that suit, so I just want to say you look really good. Can you guys hear me?
No.
No, okay. You can hear me, okay. So I'm sorry that I missed the morning talks, but I wanted to actually address a question to Jordan. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, good. So Jordan, I want to be a bit of a provocateur here and comment on your experiment. And so for me, the experiment is not about narration at all. It's all about theater. And so to me, these people are acting, they're impersonating characters in the stories you give them. And so actually, I mean, I guess tomorrow when I give a talk, I want to make that distinction between narration and acting. But when I look at your experiment and your perspective, it's really not about narration. It's really about impersonation. It's theater much more than storytelling. And I think it's an important distinction for this conference that this should be discussed. And so your experiment kind of set off that kind of flag for me. But I'm just curious what you think about what you're looking at as theater and not narration.
I think that opens the Pandora box of narrative again. I think one way we generalize the notion of narration is that it would include theater and acting. So narration is not just, you don't mean linguistic narration as narration, or on what basis would you say that acting a sequence of events in some logical progression that makes a whole is not narrating?
No, I guess I go back to Plato, because Plato made the distinction between diegesis and mimesis, where diegesis is kind of classic like third person narration, and mimesis is telling a story by impersonating the characters. So for the ancient Greeks, that was a very fundamental distinction between diegesis, which is the third person, and mimesis, which is the first person. And I think your experiment is very mimetic in that sense, that people are impersonating characters, and the butterfly, in addition, is not themselves, it's some other character. And I think that's very fundamental to what is pantomime one or the other, but I think your experiment is very much on the side of the mimesis of character impersonation and not just a third person storytelling narration. Okay.
I mean, we can continue discussing that, but I think our point was that you're very much right that it is mimesis, both in Aristotle's and in Donald's terms. But unlike Merlin Donald, we would like to say that the origin of narratives starts in mimesis, not in language and diegesis. And I think, as in usual evolutionary stories, by finding precursors in this way, I think it's easier to explain the more complex forms. So I would say, not from our perspective, right, on the elephant, not to make a categorical distinction between mimesis and diegesis, but rather in terms of simple and complex narratives. And simple complex is a much more gradual distinction.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have further comments or questions? There is one.
I want to ask if there is some idea of or some model about intermediate step between pantomime and proper language, something like sign language in some kind of evolution model, and if this this, if yes, if this sign language could be meant and as sufficient for a narrative framework. So if some kind of sign language, now this is only an idea, if a sign language between pantomime and proper language could be sufficient for narrative, and so if sign language is sufficient, why then we move to proper language, so to speech? I don't know if the question is.
Would you like most of the languages?
Well, from my experience, yes. I mean, sign language, even emergent sign language, have narratives. They do it based on pantomime in the beginning, yes, and then it evolves. I don't know if you have to add something.
I won't ask to look at the slides again, but if you remember, I finished with a slide of a tentative new model in which we try to align semiotic evolution with the evolution of collaboration. And there we had also, on mimesis we had simple narratives, and on proto-language we had complex narratives. And narrative was thought to be one of the bridges to help make that distinction between mimesis and proto-language. And on our understanding and interpreting Donald's model, and I think also consistent with how Michael was reinterpreting his model this morning. So if you mean not just sign language in the narrow and proper sense of signed languages of deaf communities or alternate sign languages, but also communicating with the whole body using iconic gesture pantomime as the main sign vehicle, then there, I think what we saw today, and I think irrespective of what we agreed to call it, there are limitations as long as you're using pantomime as the vehicle, as the medium. And why so? Well, Micah was mentioning the difference between usualization and conventionalization, diffusion to a larger community. If these signs are going to be shared in a larger community, then you need much more structure. So I think the reasons to push towards higher complexity in narrative, but also towards language and cultural complexity are many. But one common denominator is increase of cultural complexity, demography, etc. And our attempt now is to try, with the help of anthropologists and archaeologists, to look for bearers of this increased cultural complexity.
That was, I just wanted to jump in and say, I detected a whiff of proper language as speech. And I just want to stamp all over that. I will talk about that more tomorrow, but the notion that proper full language could only be speech and could not be manual, we're pretty clear that that's not true anymore in terms of the analysis.
I had the same feeling.
So I actually wanted to jump in as well regarding Angelo's question. This is a very good question, and it has been addressed in the literature under the name modality transition problem, because it is suggested that pantomimic theories, pantomimic/gestural theories of language origin would suggest or would predict manual sign language. So there have been various attempts to deal with this modality transition problem, and none has been like completely successful. But as an advertisement or advertisement, tomorrow in the first talk, so don't miss the morning session, we will have, Tremek and I will have a talk, and the very last slide will offer maybe not a novel solution, but a solution that is consistent and will kind of result from our whole argument, and it will be probably controversial, so I'm looking forward to the discussion of that as well.
Yeah. I'd like to raise one question that worries me. in the sort of things I look at in relating action to pantomime and on to proto-sign, it tends to be fairly instrumental. Coordinating activity for the hunt, coordinating activity for cooking, coordinating activity for pedagogy. But a lot of the discussion of narrative is closely related to conversation. And the only attempt I know to relate that to language origins is the gossip theory that you start with two apes grooming each other, and this establishes the joy of going back and forth. And then you could ask, so if you buy that, then the question becomes, is it the joy of going back and forth that, as the Dunbar theory says, with a larger group, says, oh gosh, I can't pick out little fleas from their fur, so I'd better talk to them instead? Or is it that, for the sort of more instrumental reasons I suggest with these micro-proto-languages, you begin to develop ways of talking to, or signing, or whatever, to others for a relatively focused purpose, but then that becomes captured by the grooming gossip need to then say, oh, I can enjoy grooming through the use of the little bits of proto-language I've already acquired. So this is now the, yeah, okay, there's the question.
Sounded like a Slavic question. Answer, perhaps?
Well, maybe this would be a great thing to gossip about during dinner, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I think so. Thank you. Any answers or further questions from the audience? And,
I mean, what is the origin of drinking beer?
Is that a question to me specifically?
Well, I thought it was a question we might further study this evening.
This might be, unless there are any further comments or questions from Zoom or from our audience on site, so to say, this I think is a perfect note on which we can end this panel. And those of you who are participating in the dinner will be in almost exactly 1 hour in the Hotel Nikolaus, and please do not confuse it with Hotel Copernicus, which is a different hotel. So our venue is Hotel Nikolaus in 1 hour from now. I'd like to thank our panelists once again.